Hello and welcome to the webinar. I'm Caitlin Sickles with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. This is the Manufacturing Public Policy Monthly webinar. It's brought to you by NTMA and PMA. And our main speaker on the webinar today is Omar Nashashibi with Inside Beltway. As folks who are regular listeners to this webinar know, Omar is the on-the-ground lobbyist here in Washington, D.C. for NTMA and PMA, and Paul Nathanson and I at PRG at Bracewell do public affairs, media relations for NTMA and PMA, together one voice here in D.C. Happy 2026, everybody. Welcome to our first webinar of the new year. As you can see, there's a great deal of content that is included in this slide deck, though of course we won't cover everything today. I'm sure, as Omar will report, we were possibly anticipating a big Supreme Court decision on tariffs, but it looks like that will not come today. So for folks who were also eagerly awaiting that, it looks like that decision will not come today. But there's still, of course, a lot to cover. One logistical note I want to share is that following this webinar, as usual, you will receive the email, which includes the recording and slide deck from this presentation. Also in that webinar, there will be a link to register for the end of the month webinar on Friday, January 30th. If you register for that one, to make things easier, that registration will automatically register you for all of the end of the month webinars in 2026. So those go beginning now, go through October. Then with the holidays, we do have one in December, but it will register you through all of the end of the month webinars in 2026. So hopefully that makes it a little easier to get it on the calendars and remember to tune in. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Omar, talk a little bit about what is going on in Congress and what folks ought to expect here in the near term. And then I know we'll be covering lots of other topics as well.
That's right. Thank you, Caitlin, and appreciate everyone setting up the system so we can do easy registration moving forward. We've got all the dates. We were slipping this one a little bit late in hope of, to your point, trying to get a little bit of sense of what the Supreme Court would do on the IEPA case, but we'll ultimately be hopefully talking about that at the end of the month on Friday the 30th at noon Eastern. But let's start quickly up on Capitol Hill. We've only had a few days with lawmakers here back in town. They did just come back really on Tuesday of this week, and we are, as we've mentioned in the past, facing a government shutdown if they don't complete certain bills by the end of the day on the 30th, marking the 31st midnight. No one we talk to in town is expecting a government shutdown. What we are hearing, given that they've got 12 total government bills they have to pass every year, they passed 3 of them in the last year. They've got 9 more, obviously, to go. They're close on the Commerce Department, which is important. That deals with the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, and there's some good funding language in there that returns and restores and enhances in some ways some funding for MEPs there. That's positive, on which we've been working. We've got a couple of other agencies, Department of Defense and Labor. Those are always handcuffed together, so those are not going to probably move next week. I'm thinking that might be the week after, or getting pretty close, unless they might need some extension, especially after the events in Minneapolis this week. We find it highly unlikely that the Homeland Security bill will pass on its own, and that likely will just have to have a continuing resolution for the full year, something we'd even heard last month ahead of this week's events. So that's something to watch out for. The Affordable Care Act subsidies, we got a note from a One Voice member today about the subsidies going away, leading to an employee jumping back onto the company's healthcare. So that certainly does have an impact beyond just what we're seeing in the press on individuals and politicians. ACA votes, the House and number of Republicans did join Democrats and all Democrats in voting for a bill. Resolution rather, on to restore the ACAs for 3 years. That's not going to get a vote in the Senate, though. There is a bipartisan group that's led by Bernie Marino of Ohio and Susan Collins of Maine that are working on something on ACA. So that's not an entirely finished issue up on Capitol Hill yet. So they've got still a little bit more work to go here. But the end of the month, everyone's really marching towards January 30th for government issues, funding issues, and also in the context of the ACA. Let's just jump into the regulatory state and what we're seeing and what's happening there. This will be a byproduct of the lobbying work that we've been doing for a number of years, dealing with workforce Pell Grants. Pell Grants have been around for a number of years, but what we lobbied on and we worked on was to change the process to allow for short-term Pell Grants that would more closely align with what industry and employers need, and also reduce barriers of the long term of having to do hundreds of hours and dozens of weeks in order to be eligible for a Pell Grant that was seen as a significant barrier for certain communities to entry, and therefore lowering it. So part of that process was for the Department of Education to start going through this process of figuring out workforce Pels and how these short-term workforce training programs that will enable students to use Pell Aid for credentials that are aligned with in-demand jobs, including those by nonprofits and educational foundations that put out there. So they have reached an initial regulatory framework, which means that they are post this meeting that just finished up this week. Those should have some additional guidance well ahead of the July 1st, 2026. So the contracting groups and the nonprofits and others that'll be providing some of the training programs can have some time to align. And that's important given that we've been working on that since 2015, I think. And it finally was included in one big, beautiful bill last summer as part of the workforce language that's out there. A number of things coming out of the Department of Labor and the Small Business Administration as it relates to government spending. DOL, Department of Labor, has created an American Manufacturing Apprenticeship Fund. The Department of Labor announced on December 19th that American Manufacturing Apprenticeship Investment Fund to cooperate, in this case, with Arkansas, expand the advanced manufacturing registered partnerships nationwide. So it's almost $36 million cooperative between that state, but also going broader. This area that we highlighted here, yes, it does. Each employers will receive $3,500 for each new apprentice hired under the program. You can see more information on how to be involved in that related to the executive order on apprenticeships down at the bottom. But what's key here, and you're going to start increasingly seeing this come out here, and those of you that are involved in the workforce community will see the pay for performance model, and that's going to be incorporated in a number of areas that you're here, and that's what you'll see also on this slide, where the Department of Labor has announced $145 million for apprenticeships that are made available to support, again, performance-based registered apprenticeships expansion. The Pay for Performance Incentive Payment Program, that's their goal to further expand what they see here as part of their efforts to meet and exceed the 1 million active apprentices nationwide that the president put out in his executive order early last year. So what the Department of Labor is going to do is award up to 5 cooperative agreements for a 4-year period for performance, focusing on the expansion of newly developed registered apprenticeships, as well as the growth of existing programs across industries. So there should be additional opportunities for our industries here as well. And we're continuing to see that trend now. That one was just yesterday, January the 8th. This one goes back to December the 30th, where DOL announced $98 million for pre-apprenticeship programs. And that is also something within the purview of what both our groups have been working on for some time. This one looks at youth build grants for pre-apprenticeship programs for workforce preparation, $98 million to go there. Again, advanced manufacturing has been included as part of the pre-apprenticeships program for occupational skills and training services to young people ages 16 to 24. Again, another area of expansion with the administration in line with their goal to look at apprenticeships. More focused and streamlined here towards shipbuilding. This is a conversation that's been going on now for about 3 or 4 years, understanding the importance of having a not just shipbuilding capability, but a workforce. And this is $14 million that is going towards funding both Delaware and Massachusetts to look at the next generation of American shipbuilders, hands-on training programs, and others. They're also working with Finland and I think one other country, might have been Denmark, but I know Finland for sure is one of the countries, I think there's another ones, on some of the shipbuilding approaches as well. And then lastly, in this space, SBA, Small Business Administration, has approved manufacturing loans The SBA has announced its approval of the 7A Manufacturers Access to Revolving Credit, the MARC loans. That was $3.5 million in working capital to four manufacturers. The loan program is the first ever, in their words, loan offering dedicated specifically to manufacturers. And what they do is a lot less of a red tape burden. A lot of the concerns that we've had over the years dealing with, whether it's 7A, 504, programs from SBA, is one, you've got to get rejected in some cases by borrowers and then have a lot of personal loan guarantee requirements. This is aiming here to streamline, allow a little bit more flexibility for a new line of credits that can still be combined with commercial, traditional and conventional commercial loans that are out there. Skipping over more on the regulatory enforcement side, the Department of Labor has issued, I believe, six opinion letters. These are pretty significant. Again, what DOL did earlier in the year is they started consolidating their opinion letters and putting them in a single space and trying to make it easier for employers, particularly small ones, to get a better sense of what the changes are in this space. And this comes from Wage and Hour Division, the Department of Labor. That's what WHD is. And these six opinion letters are pretty significant. We'll just flag a couple of them for you here. See, non-discretionary bonuses must be included in overtime calculations on roll call and pre-shift time. Mandatory roll call constitutes hours worked for overtime purposes. That's something to flag here as well under FMLA. Reasonable travel time to medical appointments qualifies as FMLA. This one on tips probably doesn't really hit our industry as much, but there are some issues up here that get more in the weeds, to more detail than getting here, on employer reclassification for non-exempt status. So those of you that have, at least in these 3 or 4 categories here, some areas of interest, we encourage you to click on the link down below from WHD's Department of Labor, and you'll find more information on those, especially to be clear, we start the year here right with understanding of the new changes. They're also from WHD. There's no action item here. This is just to flag some on the enforcement side. For many that look at this as maybe is this just a Democrat versus Republican thing, here's your answer. Republicans do it too. The Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division on January the 8th, yesterday, announced that it has recovered almost $260 million in back wages for 177,000 employees nationwide in fiscal year 2025. So that's something to note, that they continue to look at compliance assistance hubs, in addition to releasing the Section 301A data that they did back in September, October timeframe. Speaking of which, we did not put it in here, but please, reminder that starting on January the 2nd, the portal is now open for those of you that are filing electronically. Your Section 300s, your 301s, 300 days. That is usually due around that March 2nd, 3rd timeframe, and the portal has opened on as of January the 2nd. We'll do a reminder on January the 30th. We'll give you about 30-day notice, but keep in mind that those need to be out there. Those are the forms that you tend to post up around in April for those 30 days that you're required to do. Quickly, for those that have been dealing with National Labor Relations Board actions in the past or enforcement, NLRB now has 2 additional members that are on there. They still would need 1 more Republican in order to overturn previous NLRB decisions, but this does give them the green light to at least move forward on new rulings in clean cases. And they do have a new general counsel in Crystal Carey, and that was sworn in just 2 days ago. And that will also allow them more flexibility to be able to move forward on opinion letters from NLRB. On the deregulatory side, the Small Business Administration has launched a deregulatory strike force. This is done through the SBA's Office of Advocacy, a great office. We do every other month. We do calls on a Friday with them for about 2 hours, addressing a number of topics. So it's a really responsive and good office across administrations that we've been dealing with for probably over a decade now. Obama was in office when we started dealing with them. So that's where this will be done. And as always, the call goes out. Any burdensome regulations that seem unreasonable and effective, please reach out to us, or you can directly to the SBA as part of their efforts to cut on red tape there. I saw a couple of my DoD contracting friends that are on here for you subprimes paying attention. This has received quite a bit of attention over the last 48 hours here, and we'll start to get into it a little bit, but this is certainly in line with a lot of the reforms that we're seeing coming out of Capitol Hill, out of the Pentagon, and out of parts of the White House as it relates to the defense industrial base and the no longer desire to do is what we would call maybe as business as usual. And there's certainly a big focus on the largest of primes that are what we'll call legacy programs. And this is an area of warning for those, again, in the DoD community. We'll just read some of the executive order that President Trump put out there as well, and I'll just stop there. Effective immediately, they are not permitted in any way, shape, or form to pay dividends or buy back stock until such time as they are able to produce a superior product on time and on budget. Many large contractors, while underperforming on existing contracts, pursue newer, more lucrative contracts, stock buybacks, and excessive dividends to shareholders at the cost of production capacity, innovation, and on-time delivery. Here's some of the challenges that you've got with this EO is that it doesn't necessarily define what is a defense contractor. So Amazon Web Services, AWS, that is a prime contractor for purposes here. It's not just going to be of physical goods. There's going to be services. You could be providing servicing, like literally servicing for a machine, and could be trapped under this as well. I have not seen so far, again, we can get some clarity on it, how this would affect any dividend payments for private contractors and anything that's owned by a PE, for example, or a VC that's out there. But as of right now, it does seem to be targeting those large ones. You see the restrict buybacks and dividends for underperforming major defense contractors. So as this comes down and trickles down through that supply chain, there should be a number of questions for those of you. Again, this could be roughly 20% of our membership is involved in some kind of DoD, in some cases higher. And so we would definitely suggest start taking a look at some of these areas and seeing where some of the vulnerabilities for your primes might be out there. National Institutes of Standards and Technologies out here nearby in Maryland has now invested $20 million to strengthen artificial intelligence in manufacturing and cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. So that's something to note where you're going to increasingly see this area of focus from this administration as well. We followed this issue for a number of years. We mentioned it already in last month's, covering the November slide deck last month on December the 5th, that the EPA and Army Corps of Engineers have made progress and put out a new definition of what waters of the U.S. is. It's very favorable for industry compared to where it was previously on contiguous underwater waterways, and making sure that it does not take an overly broad reach as they started to do in the Obama administration. They're doing listening sessions on that. And so if you are affected, we only have a handful of members that are, but be aware that's where it's going there. For our New Yorker friends, and for those of you that might be involved or connected or drawn into New York, they are adopting a mandatory greenhouse gas reporting requirements, and that's going to collect GHG emissions from sources statewide in an effort to allow them to quantify the GHG emissions and have a better sense of what's in there. The facilities that are required to report are those that have over 10,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions per year, and the fuel suppliers, electric power entities, waste haulers. So there might be some additional forms on here. When we take a look at states like this beginning to report here, and first ones are due next year, is this a trend that continues across the country? And that's where we take a look. Speaking of trends across the country, over in California, a court did block a California labor law. This is significant in that both California and New York, which the NLRB sued back in September and October respectively, had been trying to go around the NLRB and instituting its own regulations in the case of union disputes and organizing attempts, saying that the NLRB, not having a quorum, lacked the ability to govern in this space. The court in this instance said, no, under the National Labor Relations Act, this is exactly how the NLRB was designed. If they don't have a quorum, that was intended by Congress. And so that's how this area got shot down, and that they intrude on exclusive federal authority. That's another area to watch closely. All right, on to trade and tariffs, which is obviously the main focus for this month here. Section 232, automotive parts inclusion process. That round is now open. Reminder of what this is the Department of Commerce back in March, when they initiated the steel and aluminum tariffs and ultimately put them to 50%, they created a process for steel and aluminum and autos and parts, and then ultimately for copper and heavy duty and medium trucks, to expand those 50% tariffs to cover products made out of steel or aluminum. In this case, it's for auto parts. Back on October 1st through the 14th, they were accepting petitions from U.S. associations and businesses to expand the list of covered automotive parts by the 25% tariff to more products. That announcement has not been made. So for those of you that did submit or are waiting on results from the October 1st to 14th portal on automotive parts, that is not released, but they did still move forward with this new second round, and you will see, or third round actually. And so you'll see these are due on January the 14th. They are done by via sending in an email. More information can be found down below. These are the national security tariffs that are there. Now, I want to refresh again. We just mentioned these are the 232s on autos and parts. We still do not have a decision on the inclusion request for steel and aluminum that some had submitted September, and those were supposed to have been put out at the latest by December the 6th. We'd heard that they might be coming out sometime this year, theoretically this month. So those that are waiting on the 232 steel and aluminum expansion of those 50% tariffs, we do not have notification on that as of right now. We did get notice on December 29th, ahead of the New Year's, that the president was going to delay the semiconductor tariffs. These are particularly focused on China, and this we've known for some time. This is done under the 301 law, not the 232, and these are going to be delayed until June of 2027. Buying them some space, you'll get a sense here of the actual HTS codes for some of you that are in the supply chain. Given that if these do go through, having this kind of lead time of about 17 months or so, 16 months, is going to come in handy, knowing that some of these do take some time to resource. On the lumber cabinets, kitchen cabinets, and upholstered furniture, these tariffs slated to increase to 30% and 50% on January the 1st of this year. The president and the administration put out a notice on December 31st, literally hours before the increase was slated to take effect, that they were no longer going to increase and that they were going to do so on January the 1st. A number of reasons could be put in here: elections, inflation. You believe that the initial lower rates around 25 and 10% has started to accomplish what they wanted. Regardless, those that are involved in this, and keep in mind that in some case this could impact those that are making brackets, those of you that are doing metal brackets for furniture. Yes, this is focused on wood and upholstered, but they're going to be held back together with something that some of you all might potentially make. So that entire supply chain is impacted, not just the primary focus of the tariffs there as well. We did want to flag here on USMCA, not just as a transition slide, but knowing that we did have 3 days of hearing back on December 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and they had over 100 witnesses testify before the U.S. Trade Representative. They have officially completed their review. They did not submit a lengthy written report to Congress as was required by law 6 months prior to the negotiations on July the 1st of 26. What they did do is send the U.S. Trade Representative Greer to Capitol Hill. He gave a verbal briefing to lawmakers on the relevant committees, and then submitted formally an opening statement, which the administration treated as being their official report. Where we're going from here, we can speculate quite a bit. What we do know is that we are officially going to probably start seeing the talks towards the end of January, if not the middle of the month, with a particular focus on Canada. A good amount of progress has been made just in the last month or so with Mexico in some areas that are not directly related to trade and tariffs. But we have seen them work on some of the regulatory and judicial issues that the U.S. had been focused on. Canada, on the other side, zero talks. They have not been in much discussions at all. And given that there were 1,500 comments that were filed in November in this space, we think that now that we're going to have formal talks between Canada and Mexico coming up, that's probably the most positive to get things moving. What USTR has been telling Congress is that they are willing to renew USMCA, but they are going to want to see some substantive changes. We do increasingly believe that they're going to have direct negotiations with each Canada and Mexico separately, and then they'll probably have an umbrella overall agreements that still remain under the contours of the USMCA. So expect a rocky road the next several months ahead. And speaking of Mexico, knowing that they are trying to get more aligned with the United States, they did formally vote in their legislature and their Congress and Senate to impose tariffs on countries with which they do not have a free trade agreement. This is obviously targeting China. 1,463 articles imported from China and other countries are now subject to a tariff rate ranging between 5 and 50%. So if you are competing with imports, and if you are either maquiladora down in Mexico, or if you're competing with imports from Mexico here to the States, or importing with somebody down in Mexico, all competing, all of the above, this is an important list to take a look at, especially given that it's hitting automotive parts, electronics, appliances, and this is the actual part in Spanish that you can be able to see the different rates that they're imposing, 25, 5, 7%, that they're imposing on the imports. And then you can get a better sense of the chapters. It also covers textiles. We did not include that here, but metals, articles of iron or steel, chapter 73, 76, aluminum that are in here as well. And then, of course, on the engines, vehicles, you see at the top. So now that means that these products are subject to a tariff of from 5 to 50%. And again, this is now trying to create not really a fortress North America, but and Canada started doing the same in July. We're really trying to help streamline, and so we're not seeing as much of tariff evasion and circumvention by trying to transship through Canada or Mexico to enter the U.S. market. So this is seen as a positive development by Mexico, again, trying to harmonize and more streamline policy with the U.S. ahead of USMCA talks. For those of you that are bringing in maybe some stainless or some other specialty equipment, on machines from Switzerland, or Liechtenstein, primarily from Switzerland. That deal has now been completed and it is retroactive and effective to November the 14th. On December 17th, the U.S. announced that they had reached an agreement with Switzerland. They were at among the highest. They were at a 39% rate, and this agreement got them down to a 15% all-in rate. A reminder, this is my term, not government. The all-in rate is also applied on the EU and on Japan. And that means that if there's a most favored nation general duty rate, which typically is 3%, 2.9, 4.6%, usually under 8, and if there's a general duty rate on a product, that is not in addition to the 15%. It's a all-in top rate of 15, whereas if you're dealing with most other countries, so if you're importing a product from, say, South America, if you're bringing it in from a non-EU country, it's going to be the reciprocal rate under IEEPA plus the general duty rate. So that's how you're getting up to 47, 48% on some tooling and other products coming in from China, whereas you are going to be here now at an all-in flat rate of 15%. So please make sure that this is something that you're tracking with your broker or whoever's importing so they don't try to hit you on an MFN general duty rate plus this tariff. No, that's not correct. And same thing for Europe. If they're trying to hit you for the IEEPAs plus the general duty rate, that is incorrect. It is a flat 15%, and please be on the lookout for that as well. This is more of a precursor of things to come as the U.S. is working to push out the head of Nicaragua, which seems to be happening in the next few months. They did initiate a Section 301 action with tariffs. So that's why they also gave them some time. You'll see 0% tariffs for this year, but going up to 10% in 2027 and then continuing to escalate there as well. This is a big one where I want to rest for a minute and just make sure that we've got clarity in coming out from Customs and what Customs and Border Patrol has said here with regard to content value on Section 232 for base metals. We'll notice this update came out on December the 3rd. I'm going to spend a minute or so reading through it just to be fully clear on what this is. So this is the guidance that has come out from Customs on importing steel or aluminum. The big question had gone in, what if a product is made out of steel and aluminum? How do you calculate the value of the tariffs? You'll recall in June and July of last year, they put out some FAQs that said that if it's in Chapter 72, it's obviously 100% steel, so it's covered. But then they started to go into, well, if there's steel plus other, then you get an invoice for what the value of the steel that was paid, and the tariff is subject to that. So now we've got just additional more clarifications here. Let me just start with the underlined here. Manufacturing, labor, coating, those costs are not subtracted from the 100% tariff that has been paid on steel coming in under Chapter 72 under the 232s. We've been telling people this verbally now that you've seen it here. For those that are trying to lower the cost of their steel tariff by removing the labor, coating, etc. cost, that is not a permitted action under Customs guidance. That would be considered tariff evasion for the lawyers, I assume, that would get involved. For articles that are on Chapter 73, that is for that you're going to be made out of steel, and Chapter 76, made out of aluminum. Those that are articles are 100% steel. Also, there's or 100% aluminum. Also, there's no content separation, meaning if you're bringing in a mold and it's 100% steel, you're facing a 100% tariff on that, and you are not backing out any costs. Again, labor, coating, those costs are not subtracted. This is now where you've got mixed content on this slide and into the next here. The articles that are not wholly of steel or aluminum, that meaning there are non-steel and non-aluminum parts or components included, then the Section 232 duty is assessed on the steel or aluminum content of the article based on the invoice paid by the buyer of that steel or aluminum content to that seller of the steel or aluminum. The current position of customs as of December 3rd is that this would represent what the importer paid for the steel aluminum content of the finished article and the entered value of the imported article minus the cost of the non-steel and aluminum part component of the finished article. The non-steel, the non-aluminum content does not refer to fabrication, machining, labor costs, etc. So again, they go back to you cannot separate some of those costs that are out. There are no backing out of those costs. There, if the value of the steel and aluminum content cannot be determined, then you report the duty based on the total entered value. Let me translate that. If you cannot figure it out, you are going to be paying a 100% tariff on the entire value of that import. So the idea here is, can you state that? Can you figure out what is that value? You're going to pay it entirely. We had a question that came in, can you back out engineering costs on a mold? Again, I can't give legal advice, but I'm reading a direct language that is in here. That does not sound like it would be a covered, acceptable cost to back out. Says does not refer fabrication, machining, labor. I'll go back a slide here. I would interpret it as, again, manufacturing, labor, coding, etc. would suggest that engineering might fall into that. I can't give you a definitive opinion, but looking at where they're heading with this, that might be difficult to back that out as well. I would certainly seek guidance from legal counsel between now and January 30th. If we see additional guidance on that, we will definitely include that in our next update that we've got there as well. And this one also, now going back to your chapter 72, will focus on steel for something that is actually steel itself. Surface treatments such as galvanizing and anodizing are integral to the finished steel product, not a separate component in a part. Paint, lacquer, and other coatings are also not parts. Their costs cannot be deducted. Rule of thumb, if you cannot deduct the specific cost when an item classified as steel under chapter 72, you cannot deduct it for a derivative article classified elsewhere either. Should have underlined that, but this is an important hangover sentence here as well. When you're looking at for costs that can be attributable, like packaging, we would apportion them across both where that might fit. So they're asking you to separate that out, the packaging, how it would apply in either ways. We do not break down the chemistry of the imported articles. This, for you copper folks, is very critical. We've been waiting for this for quite some time. So this one, and lastly, I'll stop reading after this, is let's take a look at our current understanding is we are treating copper and its alloys the same. Copper articles and copper alloy articles like brass are treated the same as steel and aluminum alloys. They are subject to the 232 duty, which is 50%. We do not break down the chemistry of the imported articles to arrive at a copper-only value. Chemistry is not a separate component or part. The value of alloying elements is not deducted. For you copper and you brass and bronze folks, now we've got additional clarity that took 6 months, but now you know where you are on this one as well. As we get ready to wrap up and do some data, happy to take some questions. UK has now, not UK, but the US Customs did release late last month or mid last month their UK auto quotas. Recall that the US has a deal to allow 100,000 autos into the US from the UK and engines, and that's now going to be addressed. They're going to allow 25,000 automobiles each first and second quarter of this year, and then that would be subject to a 7.5% rate. Anything over the quota, which they probably won't exceed, is going to be back up at that 25 in line with the 232s. Updates for you that deal with carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is the EU carbon pricing system that they initiated that we've talked about quite a bit in 2023 and a bit in 24, and I think once in March of this past year. They have updated their rules on implementation with now that you've got an actual fee that has to be paid under the emissions trading system that's up and running. Most importantly, what they announced is that as early as 2028, now, this program that initially this is what CBAM is, you've got to pay a fee on certain iron and steel, on aluminum, fertilizer, cement, and electricity going into the European Union, and then also certain derivatives of that. There are all products made out of metal that are included. So what they're now saying is that starting in 2028, they're going to expand that to include 180 downstream products made out of steel and aluminum, including some of these that are included here on these lists: gearboxes, chases for vehicles. There's going to be machinery and equipment, medical devices, and other metal goods. And that means that you're going to have to fill out forms and then ultimately pay a tariff potentially. Now, currently it's exempting most of the US, but where does this go in a couple of years, particularly towards the end of Trump? We shall see where that goes. So if you're covered by CBAM, that's important to you. And then just a few hours ago, the European Union states did approve a deal to move forward with Mercosur, creating the largest integrated market in the world. And this is significant that if there, let's say you've got manufacturers of machinery or other equipment or metals down in these South American countries, there's no longer potentially a 20% or some point of tariff or duty going into the EU markets coming in there. So that is pretty significant that these EU countries have now cut a deal after years, I think since the late 90s, of back and forth on where that is. Now, the big one, still awaiting the Supreme Court decision. Caitlin, and welcome if you'd like to jump in here as well. But that was, everyone was watching from 9:30 this morning. Those of you that do this for a living, we were watching SCOTUS blog. That is hands down the top authority, SCOTUS, SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States. And since I got here a couple of decades ago, I've been watching that. But Caitlin, yeah, we're still waiting. Maybe Tuesday, Wednesday is now the next decision days we're hearing.
Well, wait, we have a surprise guest.
Hey, it's Paul. Sorry. I introduced myself earlier, but yeah, I know, Omar, you were probably on the SCOTUS blog when there were 10,000 people on that blog when there's usually about 20. And they announced one decision today. It was a technical habeas kind of case. And so they were joking. We're so glad that 10,000 people joined us for this to hear about this case. But, they can make further announcements during oral arguments. The next scheduled announcement's not till February, but they could make announcements earlier. It's usually on Tuesday or Wednesday, but they usually give you a few days notice. So there was speculation, at least when I was looking at that SCOTUS blog, Omar, that it would not be next week. There's another case, the Louisiana voter case, and regarding redistricting, that kind of thing, is also, everybody was on. I think a lot of people were on SCOTUS blog waiting for that one too. That was not announced either. So we all sit and wait. I know that the plaintiff in one of the cases, Rick Woldenberg, he was booked on 7 shows today, so he's gonna have his day is free. So everybody is still waiting.
Tell him to put the champagne bottle back in the fridge.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, speaking of which, but I think this exemplifies to your point there on learning resources. I mean, obviously he was the lead on this, and now you see all these other lawsuits that were filed. The number of them, we're approaching 1,000 lawsuits being filed here, and the reason being that people were hoping that would give them standing, at least get it closer to the front of the line in the event that there were going to be some kind of refunds that would be issued. So I'd rather not take any more time speculating on what might come out of that Supreme Court decision. But Paul, feel free to jump back in here. It's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of people have filed cases that the Court of International Trade, they've kind of put that off until a decision is made. Look, there's 2 things I want to emphasize: that if the tariffs are overturned by the Supreme Court, number one, as we've been saying, that does not mean tariffs are going away totally. It just that the president needs to use other parts of the trade law, including he's got section 201. There's a whole bunch of numbers: 201, 232. There's just a bunch of options. It just is a more cumbersome for him that just slapping a tariff on. Also, there are trade agreements or trade frameworks that have been announced that are based on these IEEPA tariffs that are on. So that would have to be figured out. Number 2, unwinding this thing, and you can see up there all the money that has already been paid. Unwinding this thing is going to be really complicated. So we're just going to have to wait a little longer to see what happens.
Well, I'll draw your attention to your point, Paul, there. Okay, so if you look at the average refund, typically 20,000, 22,000, last year $27,000. Yeah, that's a dwarfing compared to what we're expecting if they allow actual refunds to come through. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of millions hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars potentially per request. And so that's a reality that you're dealing with. So that's why everyone's been on edge in town. So check out SCOTUS blog on maybe Tuesday, Wednesday. If not, it's actually a good read in general for those of you that like that kind of thing. All right, getting ready to wrap it up here. No more than another 60 seconds. Please feel free to type in any questions. We're running a little bit late here at 12:39 Eastern. PMI data. I don't need to tell you all this. Purchasing managers index that were there. You're starting to see the PMI drop a little bit. This one I flag. A lot of people tend to think that the greatest resource a nation has is between its feet. I tend to tell you it's between your ears. And when you have fewer bodies, you tend to have fewer innovation, and that creates a challenge. U.S. population growth. The Congressional Budget Office announced that we are going to stop growing in 2056, and our growth rates are going to be minimal at 0.1% starting in a decade following the next one. So that is an area of concern. Going back to that automation and AI topic, this one's starting to get a bit dated. We don't have the December collection numbers in, but thought this might help folks get a better sense of where the federal government gets its money and spends it. For those of you that like hearing us speak at your national conferences, this is one of those that we'd show you. That customs duties at $31 billion brought in November is a lot of money, but still it's a drop in the bucket and will never replace individual income tax rates. And there's how it compares to corporate rates and then what we're spending on everything else. This is a bright spot in a way, although there's a lot of explanations for this data. The White House certainly is going to continue to tout this, that the U.S. trade deficit is at its lowest point since the Great Recession in 2009. Obviously, there's significant changes going on there. The China record surplus, though, continues. Despite all the disengagement with the United States, China is shipping more and more and more to the rest of the world, and we have not seen that decrease, although there has been a little bit of drop. You see 20% of U.S. container imports from China. Now, when that's very significant, are they getting rerouted? Where else are they coming through? Vietnam by far has been the greatest beneficiary of the Trump wars with regards to China and other areas as well. And in the China front, we did have the detente that's going to continue from what we understand into at least April between the U.S. there. And here's the manufacturing slump that ends, and China is starting to peak back up as well. As always, feel free to stay connected with us with our One Voice podcast. We're recording one, I believe, next week, and that will cover just the latest, especially if we've got something on the Supreme Court between now and January the 30th, our next scheduled webinar. We will certainly cover that on our podcast led by the pros over at the Bracewell team. As always, feel free, please, we'll take your support to donate the NTMA and the PMA government affairs initiatives to keep these programs going. We did receive one question here into the chat, and as always, everyone will be receiving a PDF of this webinar, of the slide deck, and also a recording of the webinar with registrations, as Caitlin mentioned at the onset, to our future webinars. That should come out in roughly about another 2 hours or so after this concludes, as soon as a Zoom platform uploads it. One question we did receive here in the chat box: what about tariffs on manufacturing equipment built outside of the U.S.? We were at the Department of Commerce the first week in December, I think it was, or it might have been early the second week, and they still indicated to us, this was off the record, that they were still several months away. In general, most of Washington is on hold with regards to 232 tariff actions, we believe, until we get the Supreme Court decision. They were looking at tariffs as one option with regards to equipment coming in, but then also a number of other different scenarios that would be possibly in addition to that. So we do not have a hard timeline on equipment coming in. That section 232, that's the industrial machinery and robotics. Tariff investigation launched on September the 2nd. In some ways, we hope to not have an update for you at the end of the month. Right now, I think a lot of folks are hoping that those get delayed further and further. So we do not have a set timeline, although some speculation was we might have an update in February or in March on that one. Any other questions coming in? And we're running a little bit long, but had quite a bit of issues to cover. Okay. Seeing no questions come through, as always, you have our contact information. Please feel free to reach out at Jenny Stupica at NTMA and Christy Carmigiano at PMA. And our next scheduled webinar will be at noon Friday, January the 30th, noon Eastern, and registration will come out for that shortly. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good weekend.